Some men don't raise their voice because they don't need to. The sound didn't echo the way people expected it to. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it cut through the room sharper than any shout ever could. A sudden break in the polished rhythm of a luxury hotel ballroom, where crystal chandeliers glowed warm and soft above pressed suits and silk dresses, where power usually spoke in measured tones and practiced smiles. And yet in that single moment, every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every glass paused halfway to a sip. Every camera turned not because someone told them to, but because something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable. And at the center of it stood a man who didn't react. Not the way people expected, not the way the room was waiting for. His name was Ethan Cole, though no one there knew it yet. And across from him stood Victoria Hale, CEO, poised, controlled, accustomed to command, her posture still perfect, her chin still lifted, her eyes sharp with the kind of authority that had closed billion-dollar deals and ended careers with a single sentence. She had just made a gesture meant to correct, to assert, to remind him and everyone watching exactly where he stood, and in any other moment, in any other room, that would have been the end of it. A man like him would lower his gaze, step back, disappear into the background where people like him were expected to remain. But Ethan didn't move. He didn't touch his face, didn't step back, didn't even look surprised. He simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, as if the moment belonged to him more than it did to her. Three people near the back exchanged glances. Someone whispered under their breath. Someone else nervously laughed and quickly stopped. The music from the live quartet faltered just enough to be noticed, then faded into silence, because something about the stillness around Ethan felt heavier than the authority that had tried to press down on him. And Victoria felt it too, though she didn't show it. Not yet. She turned slightly, expecting the room to move on, expecting the usual flow of power to resume, but it didn't, because people weren't watching her anymore. They were watching him, the man who refused to respond the way the world had trained him to. And that was the first crack, not in her image, but in the story everyone thought they understood. And somewhere near the edge of the crowd, a little girl no older than 8 tightened her grip on a worn sweater, her eyes fixed on the man in the center of the room, not confused, not afraid, but waiting, because she had seen this before. Not the moment itself, but the quiet that came after, the kind of quiet that didn't belong to weakness, but to something far more dangerous, something patient, something grounded, something that didn't need permission to be respected. And in that growing silence, as whispers tried and failed to fill the space, as authority hesitated just long enough to feel unfamiliar, one truth began to take shape in the minds of those watching. A truth no one could quite explain yet, but everyone could feel. The man they had just dismissed wasn't small. He was simply waiting. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the marble floors and polished tables like something alive, something breathing slowly as if the room itself was deciding what to believe next. And Ethan Cole remained exactly where he was, not defiant, not submissive, just present in a way that made people uncomfortable because it could not be easily explained. While Victoria Hale adjusted the cuff of her tailored sleeve with precise control and said in a voice that was calm but edged with impatience, "This event is private," as if that alone should restore order, as if that alone should move him along. And a security manager stepped forward quickly, his shoes clicking sharp against the floor. "Sir, I am going to have to ask you to leave," he said, firm but careful, because even he could feel something unusual in the air. Ethan nodded once, slow, respectful. "Of course," he replied, his voice low, steady, almost gentle. And that should have ended it. That should have been the moment where everything returned to normal. But it did not, because he did not rush, he did not shrink. He simply turned slightly, and for the first time the room noticed the small hand that slipped into his. The little girl who had been standing quietly at the edge of the scene, her fingers wrapping around his as if anchoring him, as if reminding him of something far more important than the room they were in. "Dad, are we leaving?" she asked softly, her voice carrying farther than it should have in the silence. And a few heads turned, expressions shifting, because suddenly the story was not just about a man out of place. It was about a father, about a presence that did not match the narrative people had already decided on. Ethan looked down at her, his expression softening just enough to be noticed. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. We are. And then he straightened again, not looking at Victoria, not looking at anyone, just beginning to walk with the same quiet control he had held from the start, step by step across a room that no longer felt as certain as it had just minutes ago. 3 steps, a pause, the faint sound of a glass being set down too quickly, 2 more steps, someone whispering behind a hand, 1 more step, and the security manager hesitated instead of guiding him, because something about escorting this man felt suddenly inappropriate, almost wrong, and Victoria watched him now, really watched him, not as an interruption, but as a question she could not yet answer, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, because power recognized patterns. And this did not fit any pattern she trusted. What is your name? The security manager asked, more out of procedure than necessity, his voice lower now, uncertain in a way it had not been before. Ethan stopped, just for a second, his hand still holding his daughter's, the room leaning in without meaning to, and he answered without turning around, without raising his voice. Ethan. A brief pause, just long enough to be felt. Ethan Cole. And something invisible shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, like the first crack in ice that everyone hears before they understand what it means. The name did not echo, but it traveled, quietly, quickly, like a ripple across still water that no one could stop once it began, and the first reaction was not loud, it was subtle. A tightening of posture from a man near the bar, a sudden pause from a woman mid-conversation, a glass held just a second too long before being set down. Ethan Cole, someone whispered, barely audible, but enough, because whispers in a room like this did not stay small for long. They grew, they moved, they connected. Did he say Ethan Cole? Another voice murmured, and the security manager blinked, his expression shifting from routine authority to something far more uncertain, as if the ground beneath his role had just tilted. Ethan did not turn back. He did not slow his steps. He simply kept walking, his daughter's hand steady in his, her small stride matching his without question, as if she trusted the path even when no one else understood it. And behind them the room began to change in a way no announcement could control. Phones that had been raised for curiosity lowered slowly, not out of disinterest, but out of hesitation, because something about recording this moment now felt different, felt inappropriate, as if they were witnessing something they were not meant to interrupt. Victoria Hale felt it too, though she would not name it yet. Her fingers tightened slightly at her side, her mind moving faster now, searching, connecting, trying to place a name that should not have mattered, and yet suddenly did. She turned to one of her senior executives, her voice low but sharp. Who is that? She asked, expecting a quick answer, expecting clarity, but instead she received silence, then a quiet reply. I am not sure. And that uncertainty did not belong in her world, not in a room where every detail was planned, every guest vetted, every outcome anticipated. And yet here it was, growing, spreading, rewriting the atmosphere one heartbeat at a time. Near the entrance a man in a dark suit stepped forward instinctively, then stopped, recognition flickering across his face in a way that could not be hidden. It cannot be, he said under his breath, but the words carried, they always did in moments like this, and another voice answered, no, it is. And just like that the quiet shifted again, deeper now, heavier, no longer confusion but realization beginning to take form. Ethan reached the edge of the ballroom, his hand resting briefly on the door, the city lights beyond the glass casting a soft glow across his profile. And for a moment, just a moment, he paused, not for them, not for the room, but as if measuring something unseen, something internal, and his daughter looked up at him. Are you okay? She asked, her voice small but steady, and he gave the faintest smile, the kind that did not seek attention. I am, he said, and then he opened the door. But before he could step through it, a voice called out, not loud, not commanding, but urgent in a way that cut through everything else. Sir, wait. And that was when the room realized something it had not understood before. They were not watching a man being dismissed. They were watching someone they had just made a mistake about. And the silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was heavy with the weight of what came next. The word wait did not sound like a command. It sounded like a realization arriving too late. And Ethan stopped not because he was told to, but because something in the tone behind him carried weight, something different from authority, something closer to recognition. He turned slowly, his daughter still beside him, her hand wrapped in his, as if she understood that this moment mattered even if she did not yet know why. And the man who had spoken stepped forward from the crowd, his face no longer composed, no longer neutral, but tightened with a kind of urgency that did not belong in rooms built on control. "Sir," he said again, softer now, almost careful. "Ethan Cole." The name landed differently this time, not as a question, but as confirmation, and a ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, like a shift in gravity that everyone could feel at once. Victoria Hale watched it unfold, her expression still controlled, but her eyes sharper now, searching the faces around her instead of the man she had dismissed, because power did not ignore patterns. And something about the way people were reacting was no longer aligned with the story she believed. "Explain," she said quietly to the executive beside her, her voice low but firm, and this time the answer came slower, hesitant. "If that is who I think it is, he is not just a guest," the executive replied, swallowing slightly. "He is the reason half the companies in this room even exist." Victoria's gaze snapped back to Ethan, not with anger, but with focus, recalculating, reassessing, her posture still perfect, but the certainty behind it beginning to thin. "That is not possible," she said under her breath, more to herself than anyone else, because in her world, people like him did not stand quietly in worn jackets holding a child's hand. They did not walk unnoticed through doors meant for power. And yet the room was telling her something different. The way conversations had stopped completely now. The way even the staff stood still instead of moving. The way no one reached for a phone anymore. As if recording had been replaced by witnessing. Ethan met the man's gaze calmly, not defensive, not proud, just present. "You called me back," he said, his voice even, giving the moment no more weight than it needed, and the man nodded quickly. I needed to be sure," he replied, his composure slipping just enough to be seen. "Sir, if you are who I believe you are, then this situation," he paused, searching for the right word, but none came easily, because the situation no longer fit into language designed for control. Ethan glanced briefly at his daughter, then back at the room, his expression unchanged. "It is just a misunderstanding," he said simply, and that should have eased the tension, but it did not, because humility in the face of recognition did not reduce his presence. It amplified it, made it harder to ignore, made it impossible to categorize. Victoria took a single step forward now, subtle but deliberate, her heels soft against the polished floor, her voice measured as she addressed him directly for the first time since everything had shifted. "Mr. Cole," she said, the title precise, controlled. "Perhaps there has been an error." And the word error hung in the air heavier than anything spoken before, because it was not just about the moment. It was about everything that had led to it. Ethan looked at her, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something steadier. And in that gaze there was no need to prove anything, no need to respond quickly. Only a calm that made the entire room wait without realizing it. And that was when the second silence settled in, deeper than the first, heavier than the last, the kind of silence that does not come from shock, but from understanding beginning to take shape. No one corrected her. No one stepped in to soften the word error, because everyone in that room understood something she was only beginning to realize. This was not a simple mistake. It was a misjudgment, and misjudgments in rooms like this did not disappear quietly. They lingered. They reshaped how people were seen. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Hale felt the weight of that shift press back against her control. Ethan did not respond immediately. He did not rush to accept her framing. He simply looked at her for a moment longer, his expression calm, measured, almost thoughtful, as if deciding whether the moment deserved more than silence. His daughter shifted slightly beside him, her fingers tightening around his hand. "Dad?" she asked softly, her voice small but grounding. And he gave her a gentle nod, the kind that said everything without saying much. "It is all right," he said quietly. And then his attention returned to Victoria, not as someone beneath her authority, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone meeting her on equal ground without needing to announce it. "There is no error," he said, his tone even, steady, the kind that did not argue, did not accuse, but simply existed as truth, and the room felt it. The difference between defense and certainty, between reaction and control. A man near the center of the ballroom exhaled slowly, almost unconsciously, as if he had been holding his breath since the moment the name was spoken. Another guest lowered her eyes, not out of shame, but out of recognition that something important was unfolding and it demanded respect. Victoria held his gaze, her posture still composed, but the precision in her voice now carried something new, something careful. Then perhaps, she said, choosing each word with intent, we began on the wrong understanding. And that was as close as power came to admission without surrender, a subtle recalibration, not of authority, but of perspective. Ethan considered that for a brief moment, not long enough to create tension, but long enough to make the pause meaningful. Understanding begins with how we see people, he replied, his voice quiet but clear, and the words did not challenge her. They did not accuse her. They simply rested in the space between them, undeniable and complete. And something in the room shifted again, deeper now, more settled, because this was no longer about a moment of public tension. It was about a principle being revealed without force, without spectacle, just presence. The man who had first called out Ethan's name stepped forward again, his tone more formal now, almost respectful. Sir, I apologize for not recognizing you sooner, he said. And the apology was not just personal, it was collective, representing the room that had watched and assumed, the room that had been ready to move on without question. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without drawing attention to it. There is nothing to apologize for, he said, and that only made the moment heavier, because forgiveness offered without demand carried more weight than any confrontation could. Victoria watched him closely now, not with skepticism, but with something closer to curiosity, something quieter, something that did not belong to the version of herself that had entered the evening, and for the first time her voice softened, not in weakness, but in recognition. Mr. Cole, she said again, slower this time. You deserve to stay. And the words were simple, but the shift behind them was not, because they were no longer about permission, they were about acknowledgement. And in that moment the room understood something it had not understood before. Respect had not been taken, it had been revealed, and it had always been there. The offer did not move him the way the room expected it to. It did not soften his posture or change his pace, because Ethan Cole had never been a man who stayed where he was suddenly welcomed. He was a man who chose where he belonged long before anyone else noticed. He glanced down at his daughter for a brief second, her eyes searching his face not for answers, but for reassurance, and he gave her that same quiet nod again, the one that carried calm without explanation. Then he looked back at Victoria, not dismissing her words, not accepting them immediately either, simply holding them in the space between them as if measuring their weight. I appreciate that, he said, his voice even, respectful. But there was no urgency in it, no shift in his stance, and that was when the room realized something deeper than recognition, something that made the silence settle heavier than before. He was not waiting for approval. He never had been. A man near the front straightened his tie unconsciously. Another guest glanced away, as if reflecting on something personal, because moments like this did not stay contained. They reached into people quietly, asking questions they did not expect. Victoria took a step closer now, slower than before, deliberate, her heels making a soft, measured sound against the polished floor, her voice controlled but carrying a different tone, one that no longer commanded but invited. Then stay, she said, simpler this time, without layers, without framing, and for a moment that was enough. The air held still around the words, waiting to see if they would land differently. Ethan looked around the room, not as someone taking it in, but as someone seeing through it. The chandeliers, the tailored suits, the polished smiles that had not yet returned, all of it paused in a state that felt unfamiliar to those who lived in it every day. And then his gaze returned to her. My daughter comes first, he said, gently, not as a condition, not as a statement meant to impress, just a truth that did not need explanation, and the little girl squeezed his hand slightly, as if she understood the weight of those words, even if she did not yet understand the room they were spoken in. Victoria followed his gaze down for the first time, really noticing the child, not as part of the scene, but as part of him, and something shifted again, quieter, more internal, because power often overlooked what did not speak loudly, and now she was seeing it clearly. Of course, she replied, softer now, the edge in her voice gone, replaced with something closer to respect. You both are welcome. And that word both changed the room more than anything else that had been said. It expanded the moment, made it human, made it real, and somewhere near the back a man exhaled slowly, tension releasing in a way he had not realized he was holding. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the gesture without making it larger than it needed to be. Then we will stay for a moment, he said, and even that choice carried weight, because it was his, not given, not granted, simply made. And as he took a step back into the room, not toward the center, not toward attention, but just enough to remain present, the atmosphere shifted once more, not into noise, not into normalcy, but into something quieter, something more aware, because everyone in that room understood now, respect had not been restored, it had been revealed, and it had never belonged to the room in the first place. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not, because once something true is seen, it cannot be unseen. And as Ethan Cole stepped back into the space with his daughter beside him, the energy around him no longer treated him as a guest, but as a presence, something steady, something quietly significant. Conversations did not restart the way they usually did. They resumed slower, softer, as if people were choosing their words more carefully now. And at the far end of the ballroom, a tall man in a navy suit began moving toward them with purpose, not hurried, not hesitant, but certain, his posture straight, his expression composed with the kind of respect that does not come from status, but from memory. Mr. Cole, he said as he approached, his voice clear, carrying just enough to draw attention again without demanding it, and several heads turned, recognizing not just Ethan, but the man addressing him. A senior partner, someone whose approval shaped industries, and yet his tone held no authority over Ethan, only acknowledgement. It has been a long time, he added, extending a hand, and Ethan accepted it with a simple nod, not as a gesture of hierarchy, but as one of equals. It has, he replied, and the exchange was brief, but it carried weight, because the room understood something without needing it explained. This was not recognition built on rumor. This was history. The man glanced at the little girl beside Ethan and smiled gently. And this must be your daughter, he said, his voice softening naturally, and she nodded slightly, staying close to her father. Yes, sir, she answered, polite, composed beyond her years, and the man's expression shifted just enough to show respect, not just for Ethan, but for what he carried with him. You should be proud, he said quietly, and Ethan gave a faint smile, the kind that did not seek approval but acknowledged truth. I am, he said, and those two words settled into the room with more impact than any introduction could have. Victoria Hale watched all of it, not from a distance anymore, but from within the moment, her perspective no longer fixed, no longer certain. She saw how people approached him, not with curiosity, but with recognition, how they spoke to him, not carefully, but respectfully, and how he responded, not with pride, not with performance, but with quiet consistency. And for the first time she understood that what she had missed was not his identity, but his nature. A man who did not need to be known to be significant. A man who did not change based on who was watching. She stepped closer. Again, this time without the need to control the space around her, her voice lower, more grounded. I would like to understand, she said, not as a demand, but as an invitation, and Ethan looked at her, not surprised, not resistant, just present. Understanding takes time. He replied calmly, and there was no edge in his words, no lesson being forced, just truth offered simply, and the room felt it again, that quiet shift, deeper now, more settled, because this was no longer about revelation. It was about realization, and as the music slowly began to return, softer than before, the room did not go back to what it had been. It moved forward into something different, something more aware, because in the presence of quiet dignity, even power learns to listen. The music returned carefully, as if even the musicians understood that something in the room had changed and could not be rushed, the soft notes floating through the air like a quiet acknowledgement rather than a performance, and people began to move again, not with the same confidence as before, but with a new awareness. Conversations resumed in lower tones. Glances lingered longer, and more than once. Eyes drifted back toward Ethan Cole and the small circle of calm that seemed to follow him. Wherever he stood, his daughter now holding a glass of water in both hands, watching the room with quiet curiosity, not intimidated, not impressed, simply observing, the way children do when they sense something important but cannot yet name it. Ethan leaned slightly toward her, his voice gentle. "You okay?" he asked, and she nodded. "Yes, Dad," she replied, then added after a small pause. "People are different now." And he gave a faint smile, not surprised. "Sometimes people see more when they slow down," he said, and she considered that, her expression thoughtful. While across from them Victoria Hale stood still for a moment longer than she intended, her mind moving through layers she was not used to revisiting. Not strategy, not control, but reflection, the kind that does not come easily to those who have built their lives on certainty. She stepped forward again, this time without any audience in mind, without any need to shape perception, her voice quieter than it had been all. "Evening, Mr. Cole," she said, and when he turned, she did not rush her words. She did not soften them into something rehearsed. She simply spoke. "I misjudged you." And the sentence did not echo, but it settled into the space with clarity, because it was not defensive, it was not conditional, it was honest, and honesty in a room built on influence carried its own kind of power. Ethan listened without interrupting, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, not waiting for more, not expecting it either, and she continued, not because she had to, but because something in her had shifted enough to require it. "I saw what I expected to see," she said, her gaze steady now, "and I acted on it." A brief pause followed, not uncomfortable, but real. "That is on me." And for a moment no one spoke, not because they were watching, but because something genuine had taken the place of performance. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging her words without elevating them beyond what they were. "It happens," he said simply, and there was no edge, no lesson hidden beneath the surface, just acceptance, and that response carried more weight than any correction could have, because it did not hold her there. It allowed the moment to move forward. Victoria exhaled quietly, something in her posture easing, not losing strength, but losing tension. "Still," she added, softer now, "it does not excuse it." And that was not for him, not entirely. It was for herself, a recognition that accountability did not disappear just because it was acknowledged. Ethan looked at her for a second longer, then gave a small nod. "What matters is what comes after," he said, and those words did not instruct. They invited. They left space for choice, and the room, though no longer silent, seemed to absorb them all the same. Because this was no longer a moment of correction, it was a moment of redirection, and as Victoria held his gaze, something settled in her expression, not defeat, not pride, but understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced. And for the first time that evening, she stepped back not to create distance, but to make space, and in that space, the room felt lighter, not because the tension was gone, but because it had been transformed into something else, something quieter, something more grounded, something that did not need to be proven anymore. The room did not return to noise. It settled into something quieter, something more aware, as if every person present had stepped slightly outside themselves and could now see the space more clearly. The music continued in soft, steady notes. Glasses clinked gently. Conversations resumed in low voices, but nothing felt careless anymore. Nothing felt automatic. And at the center of it all, Ethan Cole stood not as a figure to be watched, but as a presence that had quietly redefined the moment, his daughter now closer to him, her small hand still wrapped around his, her eyes softer, calmer, as if the tension she had felt earlier had finally eased. "Dad," she said after a moment, her voice gentle, "are we going home soon?" And he looked down at her, his expression warm, grounded in something far more important than anything this room could offer. "Yeah," he said softly, "we are." And there was no hesitation in that answer, no pull to stay longer than needed, because for him, this place had never been the point. And as he lifted his gaze once more, his eyes met Victoria Hale's across the room, not by accident, but naturally. As if the moment still held something unfinished, she stepped forward again, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to close the distance without disrupting the quiet that had settled between them, her voice steady, but softer than it had been all evening. "Mr. Cole," she said, and there was no title behind it this time, no weight of position, just acknowledgement. "Thank you." And the words were simple, but they carried meaning beyond courtesy. They held recognition, not of his name, not of his past, but of what he had shown without ever needing to say it. Ethan regarded her for a brief second, his expression unchanged, not dismissing her words, not holding on to them either, just receiving them as they were. "Take care of your people," he said quietly. And the sentence was not a command, not advice spoken from above. It was something steadier, something rooted, a reminder that did not seek agreement but offered direction. And Victoria held that for a moment, her posture still, her eyes steady, because she understood now that respect was not something she could enforce. It was something she had to carry, something she had to give before expecting it in return. She gave a small nod, not as a gesture of power, but as one of acceptance, and that was enough. Ethan did not say anything more. He did not extend the moment, did not look around for acknowledgement. He simply turned, his daughter's hand in his, and began to walk toward the exit again. The same steady pace, the same quiet presence, but this time the room did